In the heart of the Indian Ocean, where turquoise waters meet coral shores and the monsoon winds carry the whispers of ancient empires, there once stood a kingdom so magnificent, so wealthy, so powerful, that its influence stretched across continents. A realm where African merchants commanded fleets that sailed to India, Arabia, and Persia. A sultanate whose golden coins traveled as far as the distant shores of Australia. A civilization whose architectural marvels rivaled anything in the medieval world. This is the story of Kilwa, the African kingdom that ruled the Indian Ocean, and the sultans who transformed a small island into one of the wealthiest trading empires the world has ever known. For centuries, the history books written by colonial powers have remained silent about this chapter of African greatness. They have erased from memory the names of the sultans who built towering mosques from coral stone, who minted their own currency in gold and silver, who entertained travelers from across the known world in palaces of unimaginable splendor. But the ruins still stand, the chronicles still speak, the evidence still demands to be heard. And today we resurrect the legacy of the Sultan of Kilwa, the African king who ruled the Indian Ocean. Long before European ships dared to venture around the Cape of Good Hope, long before the age of so-called discovery, the East African coast thrived as the beating heart of a vast commercial network that connected 3 continents. From the 7th century onward, merchants and sailors navigated the seasonal monsoon winds, establishing settlements along what would become known as the Swahili coast. These were not primitive villages. These were sophisticated city-states, urban centers of learning, commerce, and power, and among them all, one would rise to dominate the rest. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of African power and glory, stories deliberately hidden from mainstream education, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button because we're bringing you the real history, the accurate history, the history that empowers us with knowledge of our ancestral greatness. The island of Kilwa Kisiwani lies off the southern coast of what is now Tanzania. Small in size, barely 5 kilometers across, it seems an unlikely location for one of history's great empires. Yet geography would prove to be destiny. The island possessed a natural deep-water harbor, protected from storms, perfectly positioned to take advantage of the monsoon trade winds. To the north lay the Swahili trading ports of Mombasa, Malindi, and Mogadishu. To the south stretched the coast towards Sofala, gateway to the gold-producing regions of the African interior. And across the ocean beckoned the wealthy markets of Arabia, Persia, and India. Kilwa stood at the crossroads of continents, and its rulers would transform that position into unimaginable wealth and power. The founding of Kilwa is shrouded in the mists of legend and history intertwined. According to the Kilwa Chronicle, written in Arabic in the 16th century, but preserving much older oral traditions, the Sultanate was established around the late 10th century by a Persian prince named Ali ibn al-Hasan Shirazi. The chronicle tells of how Ali, the son of the Emir of Shiraz, departed from the Persian Gulf with 6 ships carrying his brothers and followers. Some accounts speak of a prophetic dream warning of Persia's decline. Others tell of political upheaval that forced the migration. Whatever the cause, Ali ibn al-Hasan sailed southward along the African coast until he reached Kilwa. The island was already inhabited by local African people when Ali arrived. According to the chronicle, he negotiated with the local chief, purchasing the island for a quantity of cloth. The chief and his people moved to the mainland, and Ali established his settlement on Kilwa. Archaeological evidence confirms human habitation on the island. As early as the 7th or 8th century, with the first permanent settlements dating to around 800 CE. The arrival of Ali ibn al-Hasan and his followers marked not an invasion or conquest, but rather a fusion, a blending of Persian, Arabian, and African cultures that would create something entirely new: the Swahili civilization. This merger of peoples and traditions would define Kilwa's identity for centuries to come. The Swahili language itself reflects this synthesis, an African Bantu language enriched with Arabic vocabulary written in Arabic script. The religion became Islam, brought by the Shirazi settlers, but practiced with distinctly African cultural elements. The architecture would combine Persian and Arabian building techniques with local materials and African aesthetic sensibilities. And the governance would blend Islamic legal traditions with African political structures. Kilwa was African in its foundation, enriched by international connections, truly a cosmopolitan city of the medieval world. Ali ibn al-Hassan established the first dynasty of Kilwa sultans, and his descendants would rule for generations. But in these early centuries, Kilwa was merely one among many Swahili trading ports. Mogadishu to the north commanded greater prestige. Other settlements competed for commercial advantage. Kilwa's true rise to dominance would not come until the 12th and 13th centuries, when a series of ambitious sultans would transform the island into an empire. The key to Kilwa's spectacular wealth lay in one precious metal, gold. In the African interior, far to the southwest, lay the kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, a powerful African empire that controlled vast gold-producing regions. This gold flowed down trade routes to the coast, converging at the port of Sofala in what is now Mozambique. Sofala became the gateway through which African gold entered the Indian Ocean trading system, distributed to merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. Gold from Africa was in enormous demand across the medieval world, fueling economies from Cairo to China, and whoever controlled Sofala controlled the gold trade. In the year 1180, a sultan of Kilwa named Suleiman Hassan made a decision that would alter the course of East African history. He organized a military expedition southward along the coast and seized control of Sofala. This was not merely a raid for plunder. This was strategic conquest, the establishment of Kilwa's authority over the single most valuable trade port on the entire East African coast. With Sofala under Kilwa's control, the sultans now commanded the flow of gold from the African interior to the wider world. The wealth that followed was staggering. Merchants from across the Indian Ocean now had to negotiate with Kilwa for access to African gold. The sultans imposed taxes and tariffs on all trade passing through their waters. They established commercial colonies and trading stations along the coast, extending Kilwa's reach both north and south. They built a navy of dhows, the traditional sailing vessels of the Indian Ocean, to patrol their maritime domain and protect their commercial interests. Kilwa transformed from a regional trading port into a maritime empire, its influence stretching from Malindi in the north to Sofala in the south, a coastal realm over 1,500 miles in length. The gold flowed into Kilwa in quantities that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe, but gold was only part of the story. Through Kilwa's harbour also passed ivory from elephant herds in the interior, valuable throughout Asia for jewelry and decorative arts. Iron ore and iron goods, highly prized commodities, tortoiseshell, ambergris, and rock crystal. Timber, particularly the valuable mangrove wood, animal skins and hides, and tragically enslaved people, captured in the interior and sold to merchants bound for Arabia and Persia. The trade in human beings was a dark reality of the medieval world, practiced by kingdoms across Africa, Asia, and Europe, and Kilwa participated in this brutal commerce. In exchange for these African products, Kilwa received the manufactured goods and luxuries of the wider Indian Ocean world. Chinese porcelain arrived in vast quantities, delicate blue and white ceramics that adorned the homes of Kilwa's wealthy elite, silk and cotton textiles from India and Persia, glass beads and glassware, spices and perfumes from Arabia, jewelry fashioned from precious stones, metalwork in copper, brass and bronze, The archaeological record reveals the extent of these connections. Excavations at Kilwa have uncovered pottery shards from china glass from Egypt and ceramics from Persia and India, physical evidence of a truly global trading network centered on this small African island. The wealth accumulating in Kilwa demanded physical expression, and the sultans of the 13th and 14th centuries embarked on ambitious building projects that would transform the island into a marvel of medieval architecture. They constructed their buildings from coral stone, blocks cut from the coral reefs surrounding the island, mortared with lime. This coral stone construction became the signature of Swahili architecture, and Kilwa's builders mastered the technique, creating structures of remarkable sophistication and beauty. The Great Mosque of Kilwa stands as the oldest surviving mosque on the East African coast, and at its height it was the largest mosque in all of sub-Saharan Africa. The mosque was founded in the early period of Kilwa's history, but it was massively expanded in the 14th century by Sultan al-Hassan ibn Sulaiman. The final structure featured 16 domed bays supported by coral pillars, creating a vast prayer hall that could accommodate hundreds of worshippers. The architecture combined Islamic design principles with local innovations. The domes, made from coral and lime, required precise engineering to prevent collapse. The mihrab, the prayer niche indicating the direction of Mecca, was decorated with intricate carved coral stonework. The entire building stood as testament to the wealth and piety of Kilwa's rulers, a physical manifestation of the Sultanate's power. But the Great Mosque was only the beginning. Early in the 14th century, Sultan al-Hassan ibn Sulaiman commissioned a royal palace of unprecedented scale and grandeur, known as Husuni Kubwa, meaning the Great Fort in Swahili. This palace complex sprawled across a cliff overlooking the Indian Ocean. It contained over 100 rooms, making it the largest single building in sub-Saharan Africa during the medieval period. The palace included residential quarters for the Sultan and his household, audience halls for receiving foreign dignitaries, administrative offices, storage warehouses, and even a sunken octagonal bathing pool, perhaps the earliest swimming pool in sub-Saharan Africa. A separate dock area allowed goods to be loaded and unloaded directly at the palace, bypassing the main harbour, a private port for the Sultan's exclusive use. The architecture of Husuni Kubwa reflected international influences. The overall design showed Persian and Arabian elements in its layout and decorative features. The use of vaulted ceilings, arched doorways, and carved stone decorations followed Islamic architectural traditions, yet the building materials were distinctly African, the coral stone and mangrove timber native to the Swahili coast, and certain design features, such as the integration of the building with the natural landscape and the emphasis on open-air courtyards, reflected African sensibilities. Husuni Kubwa was a palace that could have stood beside any in Cairo, Baghdad, or Delhi, yet it was unmistakably African, a monument to the sophisticated civilization that thrived on the Swahili coast centuries before European contact. Sultan al-Hassan ibn Sulaiman, the builder of Husuni Kubwa and the expander of the Great Mosque, ruled Kilwa from approximately 1310 to 1333. He was known by the honorific title Abu al-Mawahib, meaning Father of Gifts, a testament to his legendary generosity. And in 1331, Kilwa received a visitor whose written account would preserve for history a vivid portrait of the Sultanate at the peak of its power. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveller, was arguably the most accomplished explorer of the medieval world. Over 3 decades he journeyed through North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, India, Southeast Asia, and China, covering an estimated 75,000 miles. In 1331, his travels brought him to the Swahili coast, and he spent time in several cities, including Kilwa. The account he later dictated, known as the Rila or the Journey, provides the only contemporary written description of Kilwa by an outside observer. Ibn Battuta was a man who had visited the great cities of the Islamic world. He had seen the mosques of Cairo, the palaces of Delhi, the bazaars of Damascus. He was not easily impressed, yet his description of Kilwa conveys genuine admiration. He wrote that Kilwa was one of the most beautiful and elegantly built cities in the world. The buildings, constructed of coral stone, rose in impressive multi-story structures. The streets were well planned and maintained. The mosques were numerous and well attended. This was an urban center that could hold its own against any city in Africa, Asia, or Europe. But Ibn Battuta's highest praise was reserved for the Sultan, Al-Hasan ibn Sulaiman, whom he described as remarkably pious and humble despite his enormous wealth. The traveler recounted a striking episode that occurred during his visit. After Friday prayers at the Great Mosque, a beggar approached the Sultan and asked for clothing. The Sultan immediately removed his own fine robes and gave them to the beggar, putting on a more modest garment. This act of charity, performed without hesitation or pretense, deeply impressed Ibn Battuta. He noted that the Sultan was called the Father of Gifts because of his habitual generosity, and that he regularly distributed wealth to the poor and to visiting scholars and holy men. The Sultan's generosity extended beyond his own people. Ibn Battuta reported that the Sultan made special provisions for Sharifs, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, maintaining a treasury specifically to provide them with gifts and support. Visiting scholars from across the Islamic world were welcomed and supported during their stay in Kilwa. The Sultan personally ensured that travelers and pilgrims received assistance. This was not merely personal charity, this was state policy, the deliberate cultivation of Kilwa's reputation as a center of Islamic learning and piety, a city where the principles of the faith were practiced by the ruler himself. Ibn Battuta's account also reveals the international character of Kilwa's population. The city was home to merchants from Arabia, Persia, and India, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere where multiple languages were spoken and diverse cultural traditions coexisted. The Sultan's court included advisors and officials from various backgrounds, reflecting the need for diplomatic and commercial expertise in dealing with trading partners from across the Indian Ocean. Yet the foundation of the city remained African. The majority of the population were Swahili people, speaking the Swahili language, practicing a distinctly African form of Islam that incorporated local customs and traditions alongside the universal principles of the faith. The wealth of Kilwa in this golden age is difficult to overstate. The sultans minted their own currency, a sophisticated monetary system that included coins in copper, silver, and gold. These Kilwa coins have been found in archaeological sites all along the East African coast, evidence of the sultanate's commercial dominance. Remarkably, Kilwa coins have been discovered as far away as the Wessel Islands off the northern coast of Australia, suggesting trade connections or at least the movement of goods and people across vast oceanic distances. The minting of currency in 3 metals indicates a complex economy with different denominations for different levels of transaction, from everyday purchases in the marketplace to major commercial exchanges with foreign merchants. The gold trade remained the foundation of Kilwa's wealth, but the sultans understood the importance of diversification and control. They maintained commercial colonies along the coast, ensuring access to multiple sources of valuable commodities. They invested in maritime infrastructure, building and maintaining a fleet of trading vessels and patrol ships. They established warehouses and administrative centers in their dependent ports. And they cultivated diplomatic relationships with the kingdoms of the interior, particularly Great Zimbabwe and later the Mutapa Empire, ensuring a steady flow of gold and ivory to the coast. The relationship between Kilwa and the interior kingdoms was complex. It was not colonial in the later European sense. Kilwa did not attempt to conquer or directly rule the inland territories. The geography alone made such conquest impractical. Instead, the relationship was based on mutual commercial benefit. The interior kingdoms needed access to the Indian Ocean trading network to obtain the imports they desired, particularly cloth, beads, and ceramics. Kilwa needed the gold and ivory from the interior. Swahili traders journeyed inland to the trading centers, negotiating with African rulers and merchants. African caravans brought goods to the coast. The relationship was one of interdependence, with Kilwa serving as the essential intermediary connecting the African interior to the wider world. At its zenith in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Kilwa Sultanate's authority extended over much of the East African coast. The sultans claimed overlordship over numerous ports and settlements, either through direct control, tributary relationships, or commercial colonies. To the north, cities like Malindi acknowledged Kilwa's preeminence, if not always its direct authority. To the south, Sofala remained firmly under Kilwa's control, the golden key to the Sultanate's prosperity. On the island of Zanzibar, Kilwa established a presence, though Zanzibar would later emerge as a rival power. Even distant Mombasa, which would later become Kilwa's chief competitor for dominance of the northern coast, paid respect to the Sultan of Kilwa during this period. The political structure of the Kilwa Sultanate reflected its hybrid cultural heritage. The Sultan held absolute authority, ruling as both political leader and religious figurehead. The position was hereditary within the royal family, though succession was not always smooth, and disputes between potential heirs occasionally erupted into conflict. Below the Sultan stood a hierarchy of officials and advisors, including a wazir or chief minister, qadis, or Islamic judges who administered justice according to Sharia law, military commanders who led the Sultanate's armed forces, and commercial officials who supervised trade and collected customs duties. The army of Kilwa included both land forces and naval units. The land forces consisted primarily of infantry armed with spears, swords, and bows, drawn from both the local population and sometimes supplemented by mercenaries from the interior. The navy, crucial for a maritime empire, comprised dhows of various sizes, from large ocean-going vessels capable of sailing to India or Arabia to smaller coastal craft used for patrol and communication between Kilwa's dependent ports. These vessels were armed with archers and sometimes carried rudimentary weapons like catapults for naval combat. The dhow fleets protected Kilwa's commercial interests, escorted merchant convoys, and, when necessary, projected military power along the coast. The society of Kilwa was stratified, as was common in medieval civilizations. At the top stood the Sultan and the royal family, living in palaces, wearing fine imported silks, and eating from Chinese porcelain dishes. Below them came the merchant elite, Swahili traders who had accumulated wealth through commerce, often living in substantial coral stone houses decorated with carved doorways and latticed windows. Religious scholars and officials also held high social status, their learning and piety respected throughout the community. The middle ranks included artisans, craftsmen, and sailors, people who possessed valuable skills and earned respectable livelihoods. At the bottom of the free population were common laborers, farmers who worked land on the surrounding mainland, and fishermen who harvested the sea. And beneath them all, tragically, were the enslaved people captured in warfare or raids in the interior who performed the hardest labor and had no rights or freedom. Daily life in Kilwa's golden age would have been a sensory experience of remarkable richness. In the narrow streets of the stone town, The coral buildings rose 2 and 3 stories, their whitewashed facades gleaming in the tropical sun. Carved wooden doors, elaborately decorated with Islamic geometric patterns and sometimes Arabic calligraphy, marked the entrances to wealthy homes. In the marketplace, merchants displayed goods from across the known world. Chinese porcelain, stacked carefully on mats, ranged from simple bowls to elaborate decorated pieces. Bolts of Indian cotton and Persian silk were unfurled for inspection by potential buyers. Spices from Arabia filled the air with exotic scents. Local vendors sold fresh fish from the morning's catch, tropical fruits from trees on the mainland, and coconuts harvested from the palms that lined the shore. The harbor would have been a scene of constant activity. Dhows arrived with the monsoon winds, bringing merchants from Oman, from the Persian Gulf, from the ports of India. Goods were unloaded onto the docks, carried into the warehouses, and later redistributed throughout the Swahili coast, or loaded onto ships bound for other destinations. Local fishermen brought in their catches. Sailors repaired vessels, replacing worn sails, caulking seams with coconut fiber. The cacophony of languages reflected the international nature of the port: Arabic, Persian, various Indian languages, Swahili, and tongues from the African interior, all mingling in the commercial exchanges. The mosques served as centers not only of worship, but of community life and learning. 5 times a day, the call to prayer echoed across the island, summoning the faithful. The great mosque, with its towering coral pillars and expansive prayer hall, was the heart of religious life, especially on Fridays when the entire community gathered for communal prayers and to hear sermons from learned scholars. But numerous smaller mosques dotted the island, serving individual neighborhoods. Attached to some mosques were madrasas, Islamic schools where boys and young men learned to read Arabic, studied the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence, and received education in mathematics, astronomy, and other sciences. The scholarship produced in these institutions contributed to the wider Islamic intellectual tradition, and some of Kilwa's scholars gained recognition throughout the Indian Ocean world. The cuisine of Kilwa would have reflected both local traditions and international influences. Fish and seafood form the foundation of the diet, given the island location. Coconuts provided milk, meat, and oil. Rice, imported from Asia or grown on the mainland, was a staple for those who could afford it. Spices from the trade transformed simple ingredients into complex dishes. Wealthy families could enjoy foods from across the Indian Ocean: dates from Arabia, mangoes from India, Chinese tea. The elite drank from Chinese porcelain cups and ate from elaborate dishes, while common people used locally made pottery and wooden bowls. Music and poetry were central to Swahili culture, and Kilwa would have had its share of poets and musicians. The Swahili poetic tradition, which would flourish in later centuries, was developing during this period, with poets composing verses in Swahili using Arabic script, blending African oral traditions with Islamic literary forms. Musicians played instruments including drums, stringed instruments similar to the oud, and various wind instruments. Music accompanied celebrations, religious festivals, and royal occasions, filling the stone courtyards with rhythm and melody. Religious festivals structured the calendar. Ramadan, the holy month of fasting, was observed with special intensity in Kilwa, given the Sultan's reputation for piety. The breaking of the fast each evening became a communal celebration. Eid al-Fitr, marking the end of Ramadan, and Eid al-Adha, the festival of sacrifice, were occasions for feasting, gift-giving, and displays of the Sultan's generosity to the poor. The Mawlid, celebrating the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, was observed with religious ceremonies and public celebrations. These Islamic festivals coexisted with local celebrations tied to the agricultural calendar and traditional African customs that persisted despite the adoption of Islam. For over 3 centuries, The Kilwa Sultanate dominated the East African coast, its prosperity seemingly unshakable, its power unchallenged. But in the late 15th century, forces were converging that would shatter this world forever. Far to the west, in the small European kingdom of Portugal, ambitious monarchs had embarked on a systematic exploration of the African coast, seeking a sea route to the lucrative spice trade of Asia. In 1488, the Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that ships could sail from the Atlantic Ocean into the Indian Ocean. This geographic discovery would have catastrophic consequences for the Swahili coast. In 1497, Vasco da Gama departed Portugal with 4 ships and a royal mandate to reach India by sea. He successfully rounded the Cape, sailed up the East African coast, stopped at several Swahili ports including Mozambique and Malindi, and, with the help of an Indian pilot hired at Malindi, crossed the Indian Ocean to Calicut in India. When he returned to Portugal in 1499, he brought proof that Europeans could now access the Indian Ocean trading network directly, bypassing the traditional routes through the Middle East. This was not merely a commercial achievement. This was the opening move in what would become European colonial domination of the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese strategy was brutally simple: seize control of the key trading ports, establish fortified bases, and force all maritime commerce through Portuguese-controlled channels where they could impose taxes and tariffs. They would bring no competition and no resistance. Any port that refused to submit would be destroyed as an example to others. They possessed technological advantages that the Swahili city-states could not match. Portuguese ships were larger and more heavily armed than dhows. They carried cannons that could bombard coastal cities from the sea. They had iron weapons and armor, and they had a ruthless determination to dominate by force. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral led the second Portuguese fleet to India. On the return voyage, he stopped at Kilwa and demanded that the Sultan submit to Portuguese authority and pay tribute. The Sultan refused. Cabral lacked the military force to compel submission, so he withdrew, but the message was delivered. The Portuguese would return. In 1502, Vasco da Gama returned to the Indian Ocean with a fleet of 20 ships, heavily armed and ready for war. He again visited Kilwa and again demanded submission and tribute. Again the Sultan refused. Da Gama did not have sufficient forces to attack the fortified stone city, but he ravaged the coast, demonstrating Portuguese naval power and creating terror in the coastal populations. The catastrophe came in 1505. Francisco de Almeida, appointed as the first Portuguese viceroy of India, was ordered to secure Portuguese control over the East African coast as part of his broader strategy to dominate Indian Ocean trade. He assembled a massive fleet, the largest yet sent to the region, with specific orders to subjugate or destroy the major Swahili ports. In July 1505, Almeida's fleet appeared off Kilwa, the once mighty sultanate, which had commanded the gold trade and dominated the coast for 3 centuries, now faced an enemy unlike any it had encountered before. The Sultan of Kilwa at this time was Ibrahim, and he faced an impossible decision: submit to the Portuguese, accept tributary status, and watch his sovereignty evaporate, or resist and face the consequences. Whether through pride, principle, or perhaps a tragic underestimation of Portuguese capabilities, the decision was made to resist. The Portuguese response was swift and merciless. Almeida's forces, numbering around 500 heavily armed soldiers supported by artillery from the ships, launched an amphibious assault on the island. The Kilwa defenders, armed primarily with traditional weapons and lacking the cannon or firearms of the Portuguese, fought bravely but were overwhelmed. The Portuguese stormed through the stone city, slaughtering defenders and civilians alike. They ransacked the Sultan's palace, seizing the accumulated wealth of generations. They looted the homes of the merchant elite, taking gold, silver, gems, silk and porcelain. The great mosque, which had stood as a symbol of Kilwa's Islamic civilization, was desecrated. Sultan Ibrahim fled the city, escaping to the mainland, leaving his kingdom in ruins. The Portuguese installed a puppet sultan, Muhammad Anconi, who agreed to pay tribute and acknowledge Portuguese overlordship. They built a fort to house a permanent garrison, ensuring that Kilwa would never again threaten Portuguese commercial interests. But the occupation could not be sustained. The Portuguese lacked the manpower to garrison all the ports they had attacked. The Swahili populations were hostile and rebellious. Tropical diseases killed Portuguese soldiers by the dozens. Within a few years, the Portuguese abandoned the fort at Kilwa, though they maintained their overall control of the coast through their bases at Mozambique and Mombasa. Sultan Ibrahim or his successors returned to Kilwa, but the Sultanate was a shadow of its former glory. The gold trade had been disrupted by Portuguese interference. Many merchants had fled to other ports. The buildings, damaged in the assault and subsequent abandonment, began to deteriorate. Kilwa lingered on for decades, but the age of greatness had ended. The decline of Kilwa accelerated through the 16th century. The Portuguese, though they did not maintain a permanent presence in the city, continued to dominate the coast, diverting trade to ports under their control. Mombasa, though it also suffered Portuguese attacks, managed to maintain greater commercial activity and gradually supplanted Kilwa as the premier port of the central Swahili coast. Internal conflicts weakened the Sultanate further. Various claimants fought for the throne, fragmenting political authority. Without the gold revenues from Sofala, which the Portuguese now controlled, the sultans lacked the resources to maintain their tributary empire, and the outlying ports broke away or were conquered by rivals. In 1587, catastrophe struck from an unexpected direction. A warrior people known as the Zimba, originating from the Zambezi Valley in the interior, conducted a campaign of devastating violence along the coast. They attacked and destroyed several Swahili settlements, and when they reached Kilwa, they massacred much of the population. The surviving inhabitants fled. For a time, the island was completely abandoned. The stone buildings left empty, the mosques silent, the once bustling harbor deserted. This was the final blow. Though some people eventually returned, and Kilwa continued as a small settlement for centuries after, it never recovered its position as a major trading center. The ruins of the Great Mosque, Husuni Kubwa Palace, and the other monumental buildings stood as melancholy reminders of a vanished greatness. The Portuguese themselves would eventually be driven from much of the Swahili coast. In the 17th century, the Omani Arabs, who had long been rivals of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, began a systematic campaign to expel the Europeans from East Africa. With the help of Swahili allies who had chafed under Portuguese rule, the Omanis gradually captured the Portuguese forts. In 1698, after a nearly 3-year siege, the great fortress of Fort Jesus at Mombasa fell to Omani forces, effectively ending Portuguese control of the northern Swahili coast. The Omanis established their own commercial empire along the coast, with Zanzibar becoming the new center of power. But Kilwa remained a backwater, its moment in history long past. Today, Kilwa Kisiwani is a village of a few hundred inhabitants, living among the ruins of the medieval city. The coral stone buildings, weathered by centuries of wind and rain and salt spray, still stand in remarkable states of preservation in some areas. The Great Mosque, though its roof has long since collapsed, still displays the elegant arches and carved coral pillars that made it famous. Husuni Kubwa, the Great Palace, sprawls across the cliff, its walls still defining over 100 rooms, its octagonal bathing pool still visible, a haunting reminder of the Sultan who built it. The ruins have been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as having outstanding universal value for human history. Archaeological work continues to reveal the extent of Kilwa's medieval prosperity. Excavations have uncovered thousands of fragments of Chinese porcelain, evidence of extensive trade with Asia. Coins minted in Kilwa have been catalogued, providing insights into the Sultanate's economy. The remains of coral stone houses throughout the island reveal the wealth of the merchant class, and ongoing research continues to refine our understanding of how this African kingdom functioned, how it engaged with the wider world, and how it built its commercial empire. The legacy of Kilwa extends far beyond the physical ruins. The Swahili civilization that flourished along the East African coast, of which Kilwa was the most spectacular example, created a unique cultural synthesis that endures today. The Swahili language, born from the fusion of African Bantu languages with Arabic influences, is now spoken by over 100 million people across East Africa and is one of the official languages of the African Union. Swahili culture, architecture, music, and literature all trace their roots to the medieval coastal city-states. The traditions of maritime commerce and long-distance trade shaped the economic development of the entire region. The Islamic scholarship and learning that thrived in cities like Kilwa contributed to the intellectual heritage of Africa. But perhaps the most important legacy of Kilwa is what it represents for our understanding of African history. For too long, the narrative of Africa has been distorted by colonial-era myths that portrayed the continent as isolated, backward, lacking in civilization before European contact. These myths were deliberate fabrications, designed to justify colonialism and the slave trade, to create a hierarchy of races and cultures with Europeans at the top. The true history of Africa tells a radically different story. It is a history of powerful kingdoms and sophisticated urban centers, of technological innovation and artistic achievement, of participation in global trade networks spanning continents, of intellectual and scientific accomplishments. Africa was never isolated. Africa was never backward. Africa was a full participant in world history, and in some periods, African civilizations surpassed their contemporaries in Europe. The Kilwa Sultanate stands as proof of this reality. Here was an African kingdom that controlled the gold trade of the Indian Ocean, that minted its own currency, that built architectural monuments rivaling any in the world, that attracted scholars and merchants from 3 continents. Ibn Battuta, who had visited the greatest cities of his age, called it one of the most beautiful cities in the world. This was not a primitive society. This was a sophisticated civilization with a complex economy, a structured government, a rich cultural life, and extensive international connections. The destruction of Kilwa and the other Swahili city-states by the Portuguese marked the beginning of a long dark age for East Africa. Portuguese interference disrupted the trade networks that had brought prosperity. The slave trade, which intensified dramatically under European demand, devastated communities throughout the interior. Colonial conquest in the 19th century completed the destruction as Britain, Germany, and Portugal carved up East Africa, erasing political boundaries, imposing alien systems of government, extracting resources, and systematically dismantling indigenous institutions. Yet the memory persisted. In the oral traditions of the Swahili people, in the ruins that dotted the coast, in the chronicles preserved through centuries, the story of Kilwa survived. And now, in the 21st century, scholars and historians are reconstructing that story, piecing together the evidence, and presenting to the world the truth about Africa's past. This work is not merely academic. It is essential for understanding our world today. The poverty and underdevelopment that plague much of Africa in the present are not the result of any innate deficiency or cultural inadequacy. They are the direct consequences of colonialism, of slavery, of systematic exploitation that lasted for centuries. Before that exploitation, African civilizations thrived. They built great cities, conducted international trade, created works of art and architecture, and developed sophisticated political and economic systems. The Sultan of Kilwa, who ruled the Indian Ocean, reminds us that African history is world history. The gold that flowed through Kilwa's harbor enriched kingdoms from Cairo to China. The merchants who sailed from Kilwa's docks connected Africa to Asia, establishing trade relationships and cultural exchanges that shaped civilizations on multiple continents. The architectural techniques developed in Kilwa's coral stone buildings influenced construction throughout the Swahili coast. The monetary system established by Kilwa's mints facilitated commerce across East Africa. The Islamic scholarship that flourished in Kilwa's mosques contributed to the intellectual life of the entire Muslim world. This history has been deliberately suppressed, hidden in footnotes, excluded from textbooks, dismissed as unimportant, but it is a crucial part of history. It empowers us with knowledge of what our ancestors achieved. It refutes the racist myths that were used to justify slavery and colonialism. It demonstrates that African people have always been capable of building great civilizations, and that given freedom and opportunity, we will build them again. The ruins of Kilwa stand not as monuments to defeat, but as evidence of the heights African civilization reached and can reach again. The story of Kilwa also carries lessons about the fragility of prosperity and the dangers of external aggression. For 3 centuries, the Kilwa Sultanate thrived, its wealth seemingly secure, its power unchallenged on the East African coast. Yet within a single generation, Portuguese violence destroyed what centuries had built. This was not inevitable. It was the result of specific historical forces: European technological development in naval warfare and artillery, Portuguese royal ambition to dominate trade routes, the ruthless willingness to use overwhelming violence to achieve economic objectives. These same forces would operate across the world for the next 5 centuries, as European powers colonized, exploited, and dominated much of the planet. Understanding this history is essential for understanding the present. The global economic inequality we see today, where former colonial powers in Europe and North America remain wealthy, while former colonies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America struggle with poverty and underdevelopment, is not an accident. It is the direct result of centuries of exploitation, of resources extracted, of labor stolen, of trade relationships structured to benefit the colonizers at the expense of the colonized. The wealth of the West was built substantially on the backs of colonized peoples, and the poverty of the global South is substantially the consequence of that colonization. But history also teaches resilience. The Swahili people survived the Portuguese invasion. They survived Omani rule. They survived European colonization. The Swahili language, culture, and identity persist today stronger than ever. Independent nations now govern the East African coast, and while they face enormous challenges, they are free to chart their own courses, to build their own futures. The ruins of Kilwa inspire not despair at what was lost, but determination to reclaim what was stolen, to rebuild what was destroyed, to resurrect African greatness in modern form. Visiting Kilwa Kisiwani today is a pilgrimage into the past. You take a boat from the modern town of Kilwa Masoko on the mainland, crossing the channel to the island. As you approach, the ruins emerge from the tropical vegetation, coral stone walls rising above the palm trees. You walk through the remains of the great mosque, standing beneath the towering coral pillars, looking up at where the domes once soared overhead. You imagine the Friday prayers, hundreds of worshippers gathered in this space, the Imam's voice echoing across the prayer hall. You climb to Husuni Kubwa, walking through the rooms of the palace, standing at the cliff edge, looking out over the Indian Ocean, seeing what the Sultan saw, the vast waters that brought wealth and eventually destruction to their kingdom. The silence is profound. The harbor that once teemed with dhows from across the Indian Ocean is now quiet. visited only by local fishing boats. The streets where merchants once displayed Chinese porcelain and Indian silk are overgrown with vegetation. The coral stone houses where wealthy traders once lived stand as hollow shells, their wooden roofs long since collapsed, their carved doorways leading into empty rooms. Yet the ruins speak. They testify to the civilization that existed here, to the wealth and power and sophisticated culture of the Kilwa Sultanate. They demand that we remember, that we honor the memory of those who built this city, that we tell their story to a world that has tried to forget. The Sultan of Kilwa, who ruled the Indian Ocean, deserves his place in the pantheon of great African leaders. Alongside the pharaohs of Egypt, the emperors of Ethiopia, the kings of Ghana and Mali, and Songhay, the queens of Kush, and the rulers of Great Zimbabwe. The sultans of Kilwa built a civilization that commanded respect throughout the medieval world. Their story is not one of primitive tribalism or isolated backwardness. It is a story of commercial acumen, architectural achievement, political sophistication, and cultural brilliance. It is a story of how Africans created wealth, built cities, engaged with the world, and thrived for centuries before European colonization destroyed their civilization. The lesson of Kilwa is that African greatness is not a myth, not a fantasy, not a false pride. It is a historical fact, documented in stone and mortar, in written chronicles, in archaeological evidence, in the accounts of travelers like Ibn Battuta, who saw the city in its glory. This is our heritage, the birthright of all African people and all people of African descent. We come from civilizations that built palaces and mosques, minted coins and conducted international trade, that welcomed scholars and merchants from around the world, that practiced sophisticated governance and created beautiful art and architecture. This is who we were, and understanding who we were is essential to understanding who we can become. The ruins of Kilwa stand as a challenge to the present. They ask us what we will build with our freedom, how we will use our independence, whether we will reclaim the greatness of our ancestors. They remind us that prosperity is possible, that African people are capable of extraordinary achievements, that the poverty and underdevelopment of the present are not inevitable, but are the consequences of historical injustices that can be overcome. They inspire us to dream of an African Renaissance, a rebirth of African civilization in modern form, where the wealth that flows from African soil benefits African people, where African nations stand as equals in the global community, where African culture, science, and innovation contribute to the advancement of all humanity. This is the legacy of the Sultan of Kilwa, who ruled the Indian Ocean. Not merely a history lesson, but a call to action. Not merely a story of the past, but a vision for the future. The coral stone walls still stand after 7 centuries, weathered but unbroken. The Great Mosque still marks the direction to Mecca. The ruins of Husuni Kubwa still command the cliff overlooking the ocean. They endure, as the memory of Kilwa endures, as the Swahili people endure, as Africa endures, and they will stand for centuries more, testifying to the truth that African civilization was great and will be great again.